So hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to see such a full auditorium. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm really excited and delighted to welcome Amanda Loper as our second lecturer in our fall 2024 lecture series. I had the opportunity actually to hear Amanda speak in June. I was in Washington, D.C. at the AIA conference there, and it was, just like this room, packed, standing room only. And I was struck really by how thoughtful and intentional she is. She talked about many issues that she's going to be sharing with us today, issues around communities, about housing, thinking about things from kind of a neighborhood scale, and how that very much informs the way she approaches the work that she does in practice. Oops. See. Look at my notes here. So what's interesting about the work that Amanda does is that she really does bring this kind of people-centered design thinking to affordable housing, to market rate housing. She delves into issues around policy studies and also works at the scale of commercial buildings. So this is all really important work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Amanda today and learning from her. Amanda is a principal at David Baker Architects. This is a nationally recognized urban design firm and architecture firm that focuses on sustainable mixed-use communities that support stability and connection. Amanda, I think the home office is in California, actually, and Amanda established and she leads the firm's Southeast office in Birmingham, Alabama. So bringing it over to the Southeast. In 2021, Amanda was recognized with the AIA Young Architects Award. Amanda is active with the AIA at the national, state, and local level. This includes the AIA Birmingham's Women in Architecture Committee, and also with the ULI Affordable and Workforce Housing Product Council. Amanda is a force, and I am so happy that she is here with us today. Please join me with a warm welcome to Amanda Loper.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Oh no. Testing 1, 2. Thank you, Tech Squad, coming up. For you folks standing in the back, there are like a couple seats down here. We're going to be in here for like an hour, so you might want to find a seat. There's a couple more here as well. I know I wouldn't want to stand the whole time. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Is my sound doing okay? Okay, thanks. Like Julie said, I'm Amanda Loper with David Baker Architects. Figure out how to advance these slides. There we go. Like Julie said, our office started in San Francisco in 1982. We also have an office in Oakland just across the bay. I started the Birmingham office in 2016 after being in San Francisco for a decade. We have a small Los Angeles contingent, and then we've got about 10 to 15% of the office that's really all over. And we're really a set of, do-gooder citizen architects. We recently did kind of the JUST certification with the International Living Future. And then we also are B Corp certified, which is a really great way to self-evaluate what we wanted to do to make sure we kind of were there as a company. So David Baker started the office. This is his backyard cottage. It's net zero, passive house certified. He's got his little graffiti there and the shingle detail to the right. We're first and foremost architects. And like Julie said, we are full-blown housing nerds. And a lot of the housing work that we do in the office is affordable or supportive housing. And if you don't know, the way that our country tends to provide affordable or supportive housing is through tax credits that come through at the state and federal level. And then often there are kind of local extra pots of money that help projects get across the goal line. So this is why, as architects, we actually need to engage in policy and understand what's happening in kind of the political and land use world around us, because it really affects the work that we get to see built. So we also do market rate housing, which basically just means housing that's not subsidized. It's what you can buy the land for and build the project for, and then what the market determines is, kind of the fair rent or the cost. Through our housing work, we've done a lot of modular housing, which is a delivery method that, prefabricates the units in a factory. And this project was for formerly homeless individuals, so they're all studios. And so the mods were kind of one studio, the corridor, and then the studio across the hall. And this project was stacked in less than 2 weeks. And so a lot of our modular work as an office is in the Bay Area, just because that kind of labor climate is pretty extreme with cost of land and everything. And time really does mean so much money. In addition to our housing work, we do hospitality. We do kind of place-based boutique hotels. We also do urban design. Our work through the office has grown kind of to the block scale, to the acre scale. And so now we're doing a lot of urban design. This is a rendering where we're doing kind of a BART station and the surrounding housing around it. I know you guys have similar conditions, with your MARTA stations here. We also do interiors. We started our interior studio because we really wanted to provide high quality design to our affordable housing clients. And that work has really grown past housing to one-off interiors. We have a workshop where we do a lot of prototyping. We consult on details. They do miscellaneous pieces within the office or within our projects, like a special ceiling or reception desk. And then we also have a lab arm, which basically houses all kind of the research and folly and interesting things we do to keep us invigorated while we're working on housing projects that tend to sometimes last like 10 years. But today I'm going to focus on our housing work and really just how we try to keep a lens, no matter the scale or the place, how we try to design for people. So often housing is really commodified. It's often feels like it's designed in spreadsheets. It's designed to kind of flip. It's really a real math-based typology, and it's hard often to keep people at the forefront. But this is kind of the attitude that we fight kind of tenaciously throughout all of our work, is how to not commodify housing and make it really for people. And so we wrote this book, 9 Ways to Make Housing for People. And this book was born out of the Cooper Hewitt, like 10 years ago, we're doing this show called Design for the 99%, where they wanted to do these projects that were high design for everybody. And so they asked us, what affordable housing project would you guys like to submit for the show? And we got kind of in these heated debates in the office, like, well, we should do this project because of the way we like rewove the urban fabric and the urban story. Or somebody would be like, no, we should do this project because of like the green stare and like the enlightened circulation. And we had this aha moment in the office that we had this underlying set of design principles that were really had been informing our work, and we hadn't really articulated. And so the Cooper Hewitt allowed us to instead submit these kind of ways and strategies as part of that show. And we worked with San Francisco-based graphic designer Jeremy Mindy to develop these icons you see here, and then he later designed the book. So starting kind of large scale, we always want, before we kind of look inside the property line, you always want to look outside the property line. I think architects should be urbanists first. And no matter the scale or where your project is, you should always ask, how can this project, create, repair, or enhance connections within the neighborhood? How can what I have influence over give back to the neighborhood at large? So this is a case study in East Oakland. You can see the kind of red seam there. Really to the right, you've got this single family, really nice residential fabric, but then to the left, you've got this really large scale industrial, pretty harsh fabric. And this 7 acres there in yellow that we worked on was really located right at the seam of those two things. So there were kind of a lot of things to heal within this site. There was a lot of vacant land. Part of the site had a post-World War II housing project on there, 2 stories, kind of one way in, one way out, and then a lot of vacant land. And so one of our solutions was to provide a lot of types of housing. Housing choice is really important when you're working, at larger scales. And so we've got like a 3-story apartment building. We've got a lot of townhouses. We have some Habitat for Humanity parcels here. And then we also kept one of the existing warehouses and converted it to housing, because often, it's so hard to recreate, the soul that's found in these old buildings. It's really hard to recreate. So the most profound thing we really did here was add streets and pedestrian connectivity. And often this kind of common sense urbanism is not like radical and earth shattering, but it's so profound and has such a positive impact. And so we added neighborhood streets that did triple duty. You know, they provided connectivity back into the greater neighborhood, but we also used those streets to treat stormwater. We did parallel parking because we needed parking, but we did it in a way parallel parking tends to really calm the street because it narrows it. Where streets didn't make sense, we added vehicular connections. Because the irony was, it was a really great site. Like you've had a library, school, community room, or a community center, things like that, but you couldn't safely walk there as a resident from this site. And so again, I would say one of the most profound ways as architects that we can heal the urban environment are providing safe places to walk or to bike. So this is what it looked like before we got there. You see this kind of one way in, one way out. And the gate often is something we talk about with our clients. There's kind of an instinct to add a secure perimeter. But we feel like Jane Jacobs' rules really hold true here, that if we can design things with visibility and security and lines of sight and lots of front doors, then places can be a lot safer than with just that kind of stark perimeter gate. And so this is a lot of what that project is, just kind of quiet neighborhood fabric with really good lighting, good accessibility, pocket parks, generous windows and front doors that look out onto those new sidewalks. And then you can see kind of in the foreground of this image, because we got to redesign the streets, not only did they do kind of the stormwater and parking needs, but we were able to add pedestrian calming pieces like this raised speed table. And that's another thing. That's one thing that David Baker's really done from the beginning in the office. Like sometimes you feel like we're a civil engineer or landscape firm because we're always drawing the street sections. We're always asking, can we do a sidewalk extension, a bulb out? How can we calm traffic and make it safer for people? And then this is the 3-story apartment building, and we designed this to really try to fit in, you know, with that residential fabric. The other thing this apartment building is doing is it's hiding one layer of parking within kind of a podium base, but wrapped with active uses. Another thing when we're looking at sites is we think about how the scale and size of them relate to people, and how long it might take to walk, and how do we break this thing down into kind of accessible human scale, you know, size. How can we walk through this? And so we think about, even if we've got a large, you know, parcel, we start thinking about how can we break this down into something that's walkable and accessible. So this is a mega block. We call these land scrapers in the office. We just finished our first high rise, but we have more land scrapers than high rises right now. But south of Market in San Francisco has these mega blocks. You know, you can see over 800 feet long and 225 feet in the other direction. And we were only designing on 3/4 of it. That empty parcel at the bottom was for a future affordable housing project. This is actually market rate. So, you know, sometimes you got to figure out how to work the parking in. So you see in that middle block, we've got a garage that we wrapped with active uses. And then on either side of that, on the top kind of pathway is a public pedestrian passage that's lined with active uses. That second break is a break in the building that leads you to a courtyard that's actually publicly accessible during daylight hours. And then at the bottom is another publicly accessible pedestrian passage. So even though this building packs a big punch in terms of density and parking count, we really had to work really hard to try to break it down, you know, into kind of a nice scale and something that felt really accessible as you were walking through it. This is that courtyard. Another thing the landscape architect did here was he saved up for these really big mature redwood trees that overnight from day one really gave this courtyard a really magical feeling. And then finally, all your projects don't have to be big to make a big urban impact. Since we've started working on this side of the Mississippi, we do what I call sometimes these small but mighty acts of urbanism. So that little ice cream pavilion there to the right used to be a parking lot. This is in Pepper Place in Lakeview District. It's a downtown adjacent neighborhood in Birmingham. It's where the farmers market is every Saturday. It's really great. But it just was a parking lot, and the client didn't have a program, but they were like, we just want to make a place for people. And so we realized, we looked at that parking lot and we took 6 spaces plus some like extra landscape buffer. And we realized we could create this space with kind of this industrial pavilion that would give Pepper Place that kind of right side gateway, as well as kind of create a space for people. And that street is actually pretty fast and loud. And so we kind of backed the ice cream shop up to that loud street and faced the more pedestrian oriented part of Pepper Place and created this outdoor room. And so I always tell people, you know, you might not be designing 3 blocks, but I think just even being intentional about these edges and whatever it is you have of influence, asking how can I kind of do better by the community with what I do with my project. The next idea is about how to make big moves. We think about how we can design a bold and interesting building form. So much of the housing across the country, you know, y'all have seen it. It's very kind of anywhere. It's really boxy and rectilinear. And we've tried to ask, you know, what are the contextual or climatic drivers that might require us to, you know, create something different? And it doesn't have to be the whole building. It doesn't even have to be really wild, but just how can you think at a large scale about what you're doing with your building? The other way to think about this is if you run out of money and the whole building gets clad with stucco or hardy, does it still work? You know, because that happens to us a lot. So you can't depend on nice materials to get you there. So this is that modular project I was telling you about. And because it's modular, we had one move that was going to repeat. And so we realized with this sawtooth, we could orient windows away from the hot west side. We could orient views away from the Justice Center across the street and instead to downtown San Francisco. And it's just that one move that did a lot for us, but also creates, you know, a lot of formal richness. These 2 projects, the project on the right, we finished first. It was an affordable housing project. The project on the left was a market rate project we did a few years later. They're actually the same unit type. The one on the right was for formerly homeless individuals, and the one on the left were condos that sold for like $1,300 a square foot. But the big urban move we did here is this is Fulton Street, which is a really important axis in San Francisco because it frames the city hall. And the planning department was really skeptical of these dark masses, but we made the argument like, look, these are these bookends that are working together to really frame one of San Francisco's most important views. On this particular project, we were a little bit more subtle, and it's in a more historic context. So we kind of added these notches and twisted the building ever so slightly, and those notches align with the cornice lines of those existing historic building on either side. And it's just a really kind of mild twist, but you experience it as you're walking around the building. And then this is one we just finished in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, where we added this kind of joyful swell to the brick facade there on the right. But the whole rest of the building is just very rectilinear and calm compared to the swell. Another fun fact on this one, David Baker has started to make ceramics. And so he did several kind of Easter egg custom brick tiles that you can find on this facade if you get your binoculars out. So this is what that courtyard looks like, just kind of very simple, hardy, because all that work is happening on the street side. So the next idea is about how you strategically use the limited, you know, budget that you have. You know, you think it's the same as cooking. You know, you don't need a ton of chili or a ton of saffron, like you just need a little bit to really make the dish sing. And so we are always asking, how can we strategically use like the little bit that we have, because another part of affordable housing, and really I know most projects undergo some you know, really intense budget pressures. And so you want to think strategically about that. So on this project, our whole kind of scope was there in the blue dash, but we chose to really spend the money and the effort on this facade in the foreground. Since this photo was taken, there's a kind of new neighborhood park there on that vacant parcel. It's the gateway to this new neighborhood, Mission Bay in San Francisco. And so we knew this is the place that we want to make the big move, but we also want to spend some money. And so we did this Corten facade that has kind of these detailed sun shadings and has this parapet kind of moment that, you know, really acts as the gateway. This is closer into that bay.
The architects pay for those community housing versus just a standard block?
What a juicy question. What is the difference between an architect's fee on affordable housing and non-affordable housing? Okay, so remember I was talking about how affordable housing is funded by these state and federal tax credits. So every state has its own rule book on kind of, all right, we're administering these funds we got from the federal government. In my state, we're going to put these X number of rules on it. Like in California, they're like, you better give us a high performing building, yada, yada. In some states, they actually limit the architect's fee to a particular percent. And I will not name names on those states, but it's been harder to make budgets work in those states. And it's also been harder, to not lose our shirts, relatively speaking. But housing, just in term, because it is kind of a commodity environment and the developers are up against really, there's a lot of pressure, costs are high, construction costs are high. And so it's a conversation we have on every single project. And so the kind of big answer is there's not a lot of difference. And in the market rate world, developers' approaches and how they run their projects are kind of vary. So it really depends. That's why it's so important to find kind of a value aligned client that like wants your approach and that you kind of have the same goals, so that you are a good partnership. But it's really because we do housing and there's not a lot of extra fee, it's really forced us in the office to be like relentlessly efficient. And so like right now we're going through this unit standardization exercise. Like that's the beauty of housing. Like there's a lot you don't have to reinvent the wheel on, but then there's a lot of opportunity to reinvent the wheel. So we're constantly in the office trying to kind of calibrate what we spend time on and innovate on versus what we know works to just repeat. Thank you for that juicy question. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And I'm going to check in with my tech team and get a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, so I was talking about how a little bit goes a long way. You really have to be strategic, with that kind of the detailing, the money, the premium materials you have. So on this particular bay, because it has several different kind of facade orientations, we plugged it into kind of a Revit plugin to help us really maximize the efficiency of the materials we were using with those sunshades so that it kind of output these funky shapes. So we saved material and really we're only shading where we thought was necessary. And it also kind of created this interesting formal solution. And then it's tough to tell in this photo, but those are actually like kind of 4 shades of hand glazed brick tile. And so when you're walking around the site, it's really reflective and it really changes as you walk around. And so often where we're spending that money is also where we're really kind of amping up the detailing, because it goes back to this balance of like, everything can't be that spicy, like high-end, ingredient that you had to go to the specialty store for. You want to use that sparingly, and then you want like a great rice dish right through the rest of the building to really complement what you're making. Sorry if I'm making y'all hungry if you missed lunch. So this also manifests kind of where people spend a lot of their time. So here we did kind of this big icon bay like you saw in the previous project, but also there on the left, that's the main lobby. So we put this kind of FSC certified hardwood that wraps the lobby where everybody's coming in and out and where you're touching. So it's a really high impact zone. Here was a similar idea. We put in these kind of saturated window panels to kind of demarcate that this side is the community center side. There's another side that's to the left here at a different color that's a daycare center. But it really adds a lot of vibrancy and life to the exterior and the interior. So this might be my favorite way. I don't know that I'm allowed to have a favorite, but if I had to choose, it would be this one in Reweave. That I think really as architects, the first 20 feet of your building is just as important, or maybe even more important than, I don't know, how it looks from the sky, right? Humans don't experience buildings from the drone angle, right? We experience it in the first 20 feet because that's how we evolved, like on the savannah. That's where the predators were coming. And so that first 20 feet is so, so important. And you really want to relentlessly just kind of pay attention to that, how you can create a generous ground floor and really energize the streetscape. Because, I put this image in because, you close your eyes and you think about your favorite cities, like Paris or some of my favorite streets in San Francisco, that it's all that life. This is where the magic and the richness and the grit and the humanity and the unexpectedness of cities happen. And it's really hard to create in new construction and with our rational minimalist brains as architects, like a place to really allow this kind of activity to foster, but it's what we have to do. So again, we have this kind of relentless approach through all phases of our projects, no matter how big they are. How are we designing the ground floor so that we can foster this kind of life? This is that project I showed earlier that's kind of that mega landscraper. So we were thinking about things at that large scale, but also thinking about, some of this stuff is really common sense. Like, is there a place for signage? Is there a place for shade? Are there kind of good increments that you can divide these into good leasable spaces? So it's really just making sure that you're paying attention to that area. Another thing, a lot of our work is a concrete podium with wood frame construction above. And so where we set the height of that concrete podium in the ground floor really affects, how those spaces feel. So 10 feet is like way, way too low. And you can see in this section, this is what a lot of our buildings often look like, where we hide parking and a podium in the middle, and we might wrap it with commercial, like you see on the left, or a residential unit to the right. So 12, you could make work. You could get some mechanical space in that retail, but it's still going to be pretty squishy. For the unit, you can get a stoop, which is really important if you've got a ground floor, residential space. But if you really, the higher you go, the more flexibility you can add in the life of the building. So we really like 17 or 18 feet. It allows you to get really generous floor height in the retail and commercial space. We do a lot of parking lifts in the really kind of expensive cities we work in, because they're just so efficient and compact. And so when you get to 17 and 18, you get to double stack those. And then on the residential side, you can add a loft. But if we're often working in really transitional spaces, or just the developer has no idea what to do on the ground floor, we like 20 feet because I feel like it gives you just ultimate flexibility. You can have disco parties like you see here to the left, but you can get a whole kind of second level in that commercial space. If you actually go 21, you can get triple height parking stackers. But then you can see to the right there, you'll get a townhouse that also has a stoop. So that unit can, very much happily coexist along the public edge. So another thing we think about is this, we call it the Q zone, the quirky zone, the place that all that life of the tenant can happen, and where all those kind of that seam of where kind of public and private meet. And we pay extra attention to this. So often we go back to that street or sidewalk section and we ask, is the sidewalk big enough for the kind of activity we want to see here? And in this particular neighborhood, the answer was no. And so we set the ground floor back so that there was room for signage and cafe tables and things like that. And, I really think it's made the difference, between some of these spaces kind of lasting longer. So it's a detail that I think not a lot of architects are thinking about, but it's one that's really important to the life, that street life. And then when you're thinking about residential edges, you want to make sure that those spaces are set back. So there's a stoop zone and a buffer, not only vertically, but also horizontally, so that, again, you can kind of coexist peacefully with the public and private realm. We also like, porches and stoops because it offers this moment of kind of personalization and for that inside the building life to spill outside and create that delight. Like that stoop to the left, I walked by it last time I was in San Francisco, and the flamingos have definitely doubled. And it was a moment of, or tripled. They've been very happy and multiplying. But it was, it was just a moment of delight. And then thinking about how you can design for flexibility is really important. Hopefully these buildings are around for a long, long time. And so that means that the neighborhood is going to go through different kind of economic cycles. Like the building that our office is in, we've seen it go from kind of commercial on the ground floor, then it went to residential, then all the tech offices moved in. But because the neighborhood in South of Market, where our San Francisco office is, it's all these kind of old lofts because of the generous floor height and the way they meet the street and the nature of those spaces, it's allowed those buildings to live through various economic cycles. And we want to think about that in new construction too. So this particular project, the facade was 600 feet long, and it was really transitional. A lot of, folks were parking their campers and stuff here. We didn't really know what will this street life be like? And so we designed the base in these really tiny increments. We kind of pulled all the structure from inside them and pulled it to the out. We added common bathrooms, and we made it such that a mom and pop business could come in day one, that business could grow, or, the whole thing could be leased out. And then what actually happened was CCA, the California College of the Arts, is pretty close by, and they rented the whole thing out as student galleries, and they just used that sidewalk as the circulation spine between all of those spaces. This one is probably the most common sense way, but I feel like we still need to talk about it because it often gets missed out in the real world. But you really want to think about how your building can kind of give a warm welcome, and also architecturally how it can let people know, like, hey, this is where the front door is. Welcome. You want to set a positive tone and be bright and engaging, like these girls here. This is on one of our porches in our one of our affordable housing projects in the Bayview neighborhood in San Francisco. And so to the left, that's that porch they were on. So that porch helped us not only navigate some grade struggles we had, but also said, hey, this is the front door. And we paired it with this kind of exuberant shading device there to the top that lets you know where you should go. And also we like to kind of connect the entry with outdoor spaces. So here you have this view, right? When you come into the building, you have a view straight out to the courtyard. And then whenever possible, we love to enter through them, because if you live in kind of a dense urban environment, say you've had a 40-minute commute home on the bus or on your bike, it's really nice to kind of decompress as you move through an open space, on your way home. And thinking about things like overhangs, shade, graphics. So here we did these kind of dancing columns to kind of say, hey, this is where the front door is. You might recognize this from earlier in the slideshow. So we paired that big move there at the building scale with these exuberant columns at the ground floor and that kind of graphic wayfinding there to the right. And then another thing we're able to do in California and are also doing in other jurisdictions are open air lobbies, so that, they're not confined, they're actually more affordable, they feel a lot better, they're not stinky. And so here you can see we just came in the front door on one side of the block, but you could go out past that door there at the end, kind of to the other side of the block, and everything mixes in this open air lobby and community area. So another way is thinking about how you can make the circulation, really nice, how you can encourage people to use the stairs, how you can enlighten the circulation, connect people to nature, bring in fresh air. A lot of housing projects can have that casino feel, where you go in and you don't know what time it is. You don't know like what day it is. You smell the apartment cooking smells, you don't smell fresh air. So we really try to figure out how to connect that circulation to the exterior. So a project we did in Charleston, we were really inspired by the local typology, those houses with all the side porches there. And so we had this multifamily senior housing building that we did a sketch on it. And yeah, you could do a double loaded kind of typical housing plan, but in actuality, you really couldn't get a lot. It was like a funky shape. So we realized if we crack this thing open, let's see if you can see my mouse if I use this. Yeah. So we kind of cracked the corridor open and did this deepened kind of egress balcony that also served as porches. And then the senior housing, so there are these dog trot units that have kind of living next to that porch, kitchen in the middle, bathroom, and then, you've got your private bedroom in the back with its window. And so it really it was the big move that, made the building really interesting, but it also it gave the building a real social space and what otherwise would have just been, the way to get to the stairs. And then this is what it looked like day one. Every resident got their own rocking chair. But then we went to see it last year and the residents have completely taken over. With all kind of their own personal furniture from, Big Lots. I'm not sure where all this stuff comes from, but it's definitely not what I would have specified, but it's amazing. It's really just an expression of the community and the humanity, that's behind every one of those doors. And it's clear it's become a really important social space for the building. Another thing that happens sometimes in our affordable housing projects is some of the community spaces might get locked, maybe due to just, a management attitude or something like that. And so we're realizing that spaces like this that are not lockable are really, really important. And it's something we've really tried to focus on the last few years to make sure we get those extra spaces in there as well. On this particular project, we were designing right next to a freeway. And so we kind of flipped the partie. It's a single loaded corridor with the corridor kind of facing out to the view. And then homes are facing kind of a quiet residential courtyard. So this is the experience in that corridor there. It's a really great view as you come home. On this particular project, we're trying to cram like a lot of community center program into what would have been a good footprint, but it was kind of the back half of the building was kind of buried into a hill. And so here we cut this oculus kind of at the end of this corridor to create this interior public street. And it actually gave us more kind of daylight perimeter. So it was one of those counterintuitive things. By kind of cutting out more space, we actually got more really nice space. And all of a sudden the program fit because we were just really struggling in that piece that was just buried into the hill to get it all to work because a lot of spaces were being buried. And it created this really cool view also from the exterior because that's actually a cut through the concrete podium there. Just gonna do a time check. So this one is about how we can kind of foster and cultivate community. Another big difference we see in our kind of affordable versus market rate projects, I mean, these amenity spaces and community spaces are really important. And market rate, they're important for a different reason. They're kind of all about a leasing tour and like who kind of has the best stuff. But in affordable housing projects, these spaces are like the lifeblood of the building, you know? And so and no matter what income we're designing for, we really try to think about how the amenities can, you know, really try to cultivate connection, how they can be conveniently located. So at this courtyard here, the community room in the back spills out into the courtyard. You've got, you know, a play space that's great for little kids, but teens can play on the gorillas, adults can lean on the gorillas. You know, it's a more creative version of a play area. You've got a raised garden bed. You've got laundry in the back, which is really important because you can do laundry and watch your kids while they play. And then to the left is like an art kind of kid space and computer lab. So you've got all this stuff together, which means, you know, you're going to run into your neighbor more. It's easier just to do things like check your mail or your laundry while your kids are kind of running around. On this particular project, we did this kind of sectionally. So on the downstairs, on the bottom floor there, you've got kind of a generous community room that spills out to a grilling area. And then you've got these other community amenities kind of arranged in that bar. And the idea, we did this kind of cartoon to try to imagine, you know, what it is we're trying to facilitate. We're trying to get people to run into each other, know their neighbors, feel very safe. Also providing all these kind of lines of sight and daylight to all these spaces. You know, maybe it's late at night and you're doing that load of laundry you forgot about, but you can still feel safe doing that. Or your kids can be doing their homework while you're getting a workout. Because it really is about trying to facilitate, you know, social resiliency, as well as other types of resiliency. So art is so important. In order to try to get it into a lot of our projects, we need to give it a job, like wayfinding or, you know, kind of give a space a strong visual identity. It's also meant finding really great partners. So in both Birmingham and in San Francisco, we've got some really great artist studios that work with neurodivergent individuals that are artists that do incredible pieces, but they're also super collaborative. They're willing to license their pieces, they do commissions, they're more affordable, and it's been really a win-win partnership to partner with them. On this particular project, it's kind of a means of wayfinding. So there's a different colorway for every elevator lobby. And then the other thing we'll do is we'll, you know, license those and put them on plywood because often the owner is worried if they invest in art, you know, I don't know, I can't replace it if it gets damaged. But that's also helped us kind of overcome that fear. Student artists have also been really great partners. This was a sculptor from San Jose State who we were so happy to have his pieces and he was so happy to sell them. And so they're these really invigorating 3D sculptures on the wall of those projects. And then finally, we're always trying to think about how to make, again, like working against this commodity mindset in housing about how to have these buildings and spaces, you know, reflect the character of the community that they're in, and at those detailed levels, offering moments for personal expression. There was this New York Times article that came out a couple of years ago that talked about this kind of tension between the real need for housing production, but also one of the, you know, the results of this need and trying to address it is that maybe design can go by the wayside and we're starting to create these buildings. I call them marketecture, you know, and this article I think referenced, it was Denver and Nashville, and they're like, can you tell which is which? And so really striving to ask, how can this building reflect this place and this vernacular and this climate? Community engagement is a really important, critical way to do this, is to talk early and often to the neighbors, future residents. If there are existing residents, you learn so much, and doing it in a way that's not, box checking, but is open. And because I always learn so much from every single community meeting I've ever done. So I wanted to show an example. This is in the Mission District in San Francisco. And, it's got a really important history. This has been a Latino neighborhood forever. You can see it, you can smell it. It's all over the streets. And the question, and, a lot of that population has been pushed out of the Mission. And so this project was going to be, for those residents, but also how do we honor that? How do we express that in the spaces within the building and with the building itself? And so one of the manifestations of that was thinking about color. So we used a lot of these tiles. This is this color Mexicali rose that, we saw all over the Mission. We did a lot of community engagement. We had an arts group that stayed with us through the entire time, in addition to another community group where we were constantly kind of checking in about our choices. So there's kind of an architectural kind of formal expression, but I think one of the deeper things that's a little bit tougher to show is that on either side of this building, we called these paseos. So we pulled the building kind of in from the property line, and one side is the paseo for artists, and the other side is the paseo for niños, for the kids. So there's like a daycare center here, and there's an artist space here, because art is such an important kind of cultural, it's just in the Mission everywhere. There are all these alleys that tourists go to see. The art in the Mission is incredible. And so we wanted to bring that into the building, but also wanted to preserve it. So we had these kind of adjacent walls that we were able to keep a lot of the art. We commissioned a lot of artists. And so both of those kind of paseos that I pointed out earlier meet at this middle Zocalo, this kind of community space that we designed. Like you can see the fence there kind of pivots open for community events. And there's been so many great performances and shows there. And it's really been a place, that the community can come in, they can use this space, they can have performances. And then there where the kind of Dutch door is open, that is a kind of youth arts space. So you can see to the right, we preserved a lot of the existing murals that were there and some that popped up during construction. But then this artist space kind of looks out onto that alley and is really thriving there today. Some other detailed ways we do this is we always looked for places for kind of agricultural opportunities. This is just a really tiny roof deck in the Tenderloin neighborhood in San Francisco. And this was closer to when the project opened, but the owner had never done kind of rooftop agriculture. And we were like, let's just get those tubs from the farm store, let's just see what happens. And since we put these in, these have actually been divided into sections of 3. And then there are these wonderful expressions of, all these green thumbs of folks in the building. And it's conveniently located right next to the laundry room there. So you can do a little gardening while you wait on your washer or dryer cycle. We also look for opportunities for porches. I know, fellow Southerners, most of y'all maybe here, we know about porches. There's often not that much space, in some of these tight urban environments, but we still look for these opportunities in color or porch spaces. Also, as in terms of the interior, we're trying to think about how do you make a multifamily corridor a place that feels cohesive, but also has expression for each, individual household behind them. So we do that with color, but we also try to push this idea of this unit kind of entry moment, where people will put out their mats or they'll decorate with cobwebs, or, it'll be February and the Christmas stuff is still up. But again, it's like trying to foster that messiness and that expression of each household instead of, as an architect, trying to, with a really tight grip to kind of curate everything. And it's really lovely to walk through the buildings and see what people do with these. And then this is the story about a local artist who, we had an art budget on this particular project. And this is a local plant that most people think is a weed. And the artist, Mona Karen, was like, no, this is actually way more than a weed. It's a flower. Oh, hold on. I lost some slides here. Let me see. All right, I lost a few. I'll take you all the way to the end. But basically, Mona took this kind of weed that has this blossom and was like, no, we're going to celebrate this. So she did that big piece. But the really cool thing she did was she engaged the community in the root base of that, of the stair tower, which you see this little boy standing next to. She did this really cool community engagement process where they all like cast visions and dreams for their future home. And that's what's depicted there in the image to the right. It was like this utopia that like ran on green energy and had like markets and, you know, play areas. But then also at least a dozen different languages are spoken in this building. And so the residents themselves like went out and kind of painted welcome in their home language. And so it was a really cool way to combine, you know, bringing art in, but allowing this art piece to really personally express the community that lives in that building. Because it really is all about the residents. And the other thing we do at the office is we always go to our project openings to remind us about that. Because the reality of this work and any work of scale or architecture, y'all, you picked a hard profession. You know, it's tough. Like we're organizing the waterproofing and the structural, and we're trying to think about design and people. And it, you know, it's a slog. So you got to stay tenacious. And the inspiration for us is really the people. So like we'll go to our like project grand openings, and all you have to hear is that somebody, you know, used to live in their car and now they have a home and now they can thrive. You know, it'll wreck you and it'll refill your bucket to coordinate whatever waterproofing you need, you know, to make that house happen for that person. So thank you so much. It is time for questions. And I think we have some mics, maybe. There's a question over here. Thank you for these.
So first of all, thank you for this talk. It was very informative, and it's awesome to see the community-based efforts you guys have done, because we talk about sustainability a lot, and I've found that like community-based efforts are the first step. But my question is a little separate from what you've shown. There's a lot of innovation in the way of shaping the community, but I'm curious as to if there's been any innovation at all in the shape of a single unit or groupings of units.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we could do a whole talk on that. Great question. Yeah, like one that comes to mind is we do this puzzle unit. So, you know, if you can imagine a studio apartment next to a 1-bedroom apartment is like 24 plus, I don't know, let's call it 12 feet if we're doing a really tiny studio. We we call this a puzzle unit. It's where the bathrooms kind of interlock. And so I'd be happy to share this. You probably could search it on our website and find one, but it basically provides a studio that has a separate sleeping nook, so they don't have to entertain on their bed, you know, if they've got friends over. But then the 1-bedroom works just as great. And if you kind of think about a linear, you know, the length of a building, or to be crass, the sausage that we sometimes call it in the office, you can actually get a lot more units that way. But then that studio especially gets a lot better. So like that's one example. Another one is on that Williams Terrace project that had those kind of single dog trot units, because you get that cross ventilation, it's single loaded corridor. And again, we don't always have that opportunity in our typology, but it's been really cool to walk that project after the fact and see that people really do have their doors propped open. And there is that like engagement between the exterior porch and the unit. Yeah, that's just a small sample of unit innovations. Oh, but I will say the one unit, that exercise I mentioned, the size of our units are also starting to be really tied to these funding requirements. So like California, you basically, once you get past a certain size, it's actually like it's kind of financially harmful to the project. And that actually is what inspired our unit standardization in the office, just because we found ourselves kind of doing that work on every project. So not glamorous, but I think there's been a lot of innovation, because there's been like 12 of us that meet really regularly about how to just perfect this like really simple studio or this really simple 1-bedroom. Because the reality is, even though we're doing these units with like 100 or buildings with hundreds of units, I mean, it's so important, like where the dishwasher is next to the sink, and did you use that extra 12 inches like you should have? And so that effort has really allowed us to dive deeper than we normally get to. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us. It was a great lecture. There was a question halfway through at the break about, the difference in architects' pay between, market rate and tax supported or, subsidized. But what I wanted to ask is, we see as students and professors of architecture how much you get out of these projects and how it fills your bucket, as you say.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you could give us an example for your market rate clients,
Yeah.
the learning that has taken place or the surprise of the unexpected return, not necessarily financial, but the unexpected personal return or their professional return on the energy that you've put in and how you've created something special and maybe how it's changed their practice as developers.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, the thing is we get to work with some actually really, really great market rate clients too, that are really innovative and value aligned. And the interesting thing, if you're not using a government subsidy, you have all this freedom to innovate that we might not have on a subsidized project, which has been just really interesting. Like even, the Alabama rules, like that tell you like to use a particular kitchen sink. That feels a little overprescribed, whereas market rate, you're really asking how to make the best thing because it is so market driven, how to make the best place. And so it's allowed a lot of freedom. But then a lot of the market rate projects we've done are really at scale, and they'd have allowed us to do a lot of these kind of urban kind of reconnections and activations. And so I think we've had a lot of fun on the ground floor of a lot of these market rate projects. But yeah, I think the key on no matter what type of housing, because just because you do affordable doesn't necessarily mean you're value aligned, and we've kind of had to learn that the hard way, is really if we find folks that we're all kind of after the same thing around placemaking and the kind of homes and places we want to provide, it creates such a rich partnership. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you. I think there was also a question over here.
So I saw that you guys have an office in Los Angeles, and it kind of sparked my curiosity to ask about earthquakes in California and how you might have to deal with being sustainable, but also considering safety with some of your buildings and
Yeah, practicing in California and then outside of California has given me great appreciation for building codes, actually. I feel like usually as architects, we kind of complain about them. But the building code and the structural code really handle a lot of that concern. It also means there are materials we can't use. Like we can't use full brick over in California. So that's been something, again, that on this side of the Mississippi, we've been like, oh, we can use like full brick because it won't get like shaken off onto people. So that's been really interesting. But I really miss the California building code in terms of the energy performance requirements. And again, it's why as an architect, I'm not going to pretend to be like really hyped into the code because I'm not, but it matters, like the fact that there is nothing I can hold on to in some states we're working on, regionally that push for better performance, for example. I mean, I'm like out of tools, or we've just had to redirect the conversation around building performance. It's really not about that anymore. It's more about kind of what benefits the residents, what does resiliency look like here? But so yeah, I mean, building codes are really important, which is why I'll also just pump, if you are really into that, like advocacy in those spaces is really, really important because it's so very much is, manifests what we see out in the built environment.
What would you say the percentage of these projects that you're working on are like changing or renovating pre-existing structures versus working on like empty lots or reconstructing vacant spaces? What differs those projects and what the percentage of which ones you work on are?
Yeah, it's really varied throughout the office. Like before I think like maybe in the late 90s and early 2000s, like David was doing like all these warehouse conversions in San Francisco because those buildings were ripe and like ready to be reinvigorated, and like the tech first tech boom was happening and all this stuff. But then we kind of stopped doing a lot of adaptive reuse in San Francisco. And a lot of it was just like urban infill. And often they were really challenging, like weird sites, because the market often will grab all the good ones. And then we got to figure out how we're going to like jam, units into like a triangular funky site or something. But that's also been a nice thing about working more in Birmingham. There's like an embarrassment of riches over there in terms of its building stock. So we've gotten to do a lot more, but we're also, there's a lot of interest and now funding to really look at, existing housing and how can we do like deep green energy retrofits. So we're like doing one of those in DC. So I would say to answer your question, it really has kind of changed throughout like the economic cycle and kind of funding opportunity, but adaptive reuse is so fun and hard. But like the kind of product, like places you can create when you're leveraging that like old palimpsest is just, it's so good.
Hello. Wondering where you find you have the greatest influence as a designer in the public policy side? And are there any specific initiatives that the firm takes on to influence policy?
Yes, thank you for that question. So this is one of those things, David, it's always been a part of his ethos. When I started, I went right from architecture school to David's office and, we were always wearing the buttons for like whatever proposition was on the ballot. And, he gave to particular campaign, like he really has always demonstrated this deep awareness, of what's going on in the political landscape and understanding you need to engage. But some tangible ways that's occurred is, so in San Francisco, I gave a talk about density. And we had a lot, like 60% of the city was single family zoning at that time. And I put the map up and I was like, if we have a housing crisis, I don't know why this is here. And we connected with the folks from the city after that. And we did a study for them that basically were to look at how can we unlock density on the west side where there's all this single family. And so we did like a lot of feasibility studies, like what would make economic sense that they then rolled into an actual policy. And then in Nashville, there's a pretty active ULI chapter there, and there's a housing action group that I'm on. And, like one of the local counselors is part of the group, and she'll like be like, I'm thinking about this policy. What does this group think? And in Birmingham, it's just smaller. So like I saw somebody on the street the other day and I mentioned something about the code and they put me on an email about talking to the technical group. And I think there's different opportunities no matter where you are. Going to your community meetings, just really engaging. But I think there's just different opportunities. And if we put the effort in, I feel like we can make a lot of impact. And we're the people that should be making impact. Like, look at this training you're getting here. Like, we need these voices at city council, like in the room with the city folks that are wrestling with policy. And the cool thing has been that it's not, we've never had to like convince people at the city. They've been really happy to have data and our kind of professional opinion to help support them because they don't want to roll out policies, that don't work. So yeah, if you had told me in architecture school that would be something that made me light up, I don't know that I would have believed you. But again, it like really affects the built environment. It's really important.
First of all, it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I have one question. So regarding you shared the senior living project with us, I think that's a very interesting and very great stuff when we're seeing like a senior living people, they moving their furniture to the front porch, front deck. And also I noticed that front deck is also play as a vertical circulation area, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so this kind of create a very interesting interactive and the collaborative like community connection area on that. But I remember that project is in Charleston, right?
Yeah.
In the South area. So I'm wondering like when you consider about those senior living or affordable housing project vary in different location. If, for example, if that in Boston, right?
Mm-hmm.
The weather, this environmental feature will not allow you to do that. So I wonder like what's the other design idea you have to kind of achieve this similar to create interactive community connection, but also like not just instead of just transfer the exterior space into the interior, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would wonder on what other ideas.
Yeah, we're doing some work in DC right now, and we're kind of coming up with this senior housing playbook and trying to figure out what were some climatically appropriate ways to do that. I saw a great precedent. This is more on the individual scale, but that had taken a building that had existing balconies and they added kind of winter gardens. You know, they converted those to more of kind of an enclosed solar space. And so I think thinking about how you can provide a space that could be closed off either at the individual level or at the community level, because there also are some really nice days, right? So how can you use those spaces, like maybe just in the winter months, you're kind of on the inside, but you're still looking out. Then on those nice months, how do you kind of pair those two?
Hi. So in school, we're encouraged to interject like our own voices and like individual thinking into our projects. And when you move out into such like a development driven kind of zone or area, how does that voice diminish, and in what ways can you salvage it and uh interject that voice and individuality when design seems to come second to budget and effectiveness?
Yeah, so much of that is about kind of reading the room, understanding with a particular client and a particular projects, what are the opportunities? And some stuff you don't even have to make a big deal about, you know, like you don't have to talk about how you might be designing something that has a great stair that connects to the courtyard. You know, some of this stuff can be kind of embedded. But we've started to have these kind of project goal setting meetings before we do any work. We'll like tour projects, we'll talk about residents, we'll do like a resiliency analysis, like what is it that this building needs to kind of do versus just start, which we used to do. And that has really helped because it's established some like common, you know, hey, we all said we wanted to do this, you know, and we check in on that at the kind of end and beginning of each project phase. But then I think so much too of what you're hinting at is it's about like reading the room and seeing what you can push. And sometimes you go for all of it, right? Knowing that, okay, some of it's going to go. So some of it's strategy. You're like, all right, well, this probably won't make it, but if we put this in, that can go and maybe this thing can make it. And sometimes you get everything. So I would say it's kind of case by case, but just continuing to push, but also knowing when, as architects, because I don't want this to be construed as, you know, we sometimes have that reputation of kind of interjecting our voice, like you said. I think making sure you approach the table with kind of a humility and put your ego down. Because I mean, often a client will push on us for something and I'll have an instinct of like, oh, they're wrong. But I put that down and I'm like, well, what's the nugget of what they're concerned about right now? Oh, well, they really don't want me to add this building doodad. Like they said, they are worried there's not enough depth on this facade, right? And so we got to put our egos down and we got to go down. Maybe we're not going to put the doodad on there like they said, but like how else could we get the depth? Or yeah, they're trying to make the project pencil and it doesn't pencil. What can we do? So I do think it's really important to kind of keep your ego in check in these conversations too. All right. Oh.
I just had a question because I know parking is such an important thing in residential buildings or projects. Do you have a specific way or thought process behind dealing with parking solutions, especially like there's regulations on how many parking needs to go with types of units and stuff like that? Or do you ever feel like community space or retail space is lost due to dealing with parking solutions?
Yes. We have this statement in the office that I'm not happy about, but it's like form follows parking, you know? But it depends where you're practicing. Birmingham just rolled back its parking requirements. You know, like San Francisco, I can remember when they rolled back their parking requirements. You know, often we're not doing any parking there or we're using parking lifts. But in a lot of places like Raleigh, we're doing some work there. We have to ask, how can, in a livable way, can we get the parking this project needs, but also make sure it's about, you know, people. So, which I think has been another really nice thing about practicing outside of California. It forces us to ask, what does better look like here? So what does pushing on this project in this place mean? And so in Birmingham, we just did an 11 unit kind of urban infill project, and get ready, we only did 4 parking spaces. Yeah, I mean, that's radical stuff, you know, whereas in San Francisco, it's not radical. And so like there, we saw an opportunity to do less parking and we got more units and it's got an urban courtyard and that's great. But then on that landscraper I showed, we actually had to provide parking not only for the residences, but there was an office across the street. And so we often, the same way our brains think in housing modules, sadly, it also thinks in parking modules. You know, kind of what's a double loaded bay? What size do you need a garage to be efficient? And these are kind of pieces you need in your pocket to kind of as your site planning. So, I mean, it really depends on what each site needs. So we ask, how much can we push it here? And then after we've figured that out, what we really need, we think we know we need to get that parking, but how can we continue to prioritize people? Like even on this project in Nashville we're working on, we caught ourselves because our client, like just, you know, the program had continued to evolve and we got together and looked at the site plan and we were like, y'all, it just feels like parking lots, you know, and we had to kind of take a step back and we had a hard conversation with the client, like we can build this, but you're not going to be, it's not going to create the place you want. And so we just had that conversation and we were like, there's a lever you can pull. We could do structured parking, which is going to cost a little bit more, but it would do this. We could go down on the parking ratio. And so we're just always trying to, you know, keep the people over the parking, which is a very real struggle. But one that, you know, we have to have.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. Let's thank Amanda again for a great lecture.
Thank you.
And our next lecture will be on Thursday, October the 3rd. It'll be our Portman critic, Thomas Pfeiffer. So look forward to seeing you all back for that one. Have a great day.